At 89, the tragedy of Diane Ladd is beyond heartbreaking. There are deaths in Hollywood that feel like footnotes, and then there are those that tear open entire chapters. Diane Ladd's final morning belonged to the second kind. Before the sun rose above Ojai, the quiet town where she spent her last years, a fragile breath slipped from a woman who had already survived more tragedies than most families endure in a century. But the truth is, her story didn't end in that room. It began long before in the shadows of a broken marriage, in the ashes of a child she buried with her own hands, in the storms that nearly stole her life, not once, but twice. Her daughter, Laura Dern, would later whisper, "She was supposed to be gone years ago, but somehow she kept coming back," a line both haunting and miraculous. Investigators, journalists, family members each saw a different version of Diane. To some, she was the Southern warrior. To others, the wounded mother. To Hollywood, she was the rare kind of actress whose pain made her performances too real. And the strangest part? Doctors once told her she had only 6 months to live. Yet she survived another decade, as if fighting a countdown no one else could see. But behind the triumphant comeback, something darker brewed, a fear she never spoke publicly. A secret tied to the illness that almost killed her and the guilt she carried over the child she lost. A grief her closest friends say never stopped following her around like a second shadow. Diane Ladd didn't just live through Hollywood. She bled through it. Diane Ladd did not arrive in Hollywood like a star falling from the sky. She arrived like a storm rolling in from the American South, slow, quiet, and carrying more electricity than anyone realized. Born in 1,935 inches, Meridian, Mississippi, she grew up surrounded by humidity, gospel hymns, and the kind of family secrets that stain old wooden floors. Her relatives used to say she was born with an extra sense, and decades later, journalists would write that she had a way of seeing through people, not at them. Maybe that was why her characters always felt like real human beings, not performances. To the industry, she was the actress who made broken women unforgettable. To critics, she was the rare figure who could stand toe-to-toe with titans like Nicholson and Hopper without flinching. To Laura Dern, she was a mother made of soft hands and steel bones. But beneath every accolade, there was always another voice, the one from the early court documents of her divorce with Bruce Dern, describing instability, conflict, rage, words that hinted at a home far more turbulent than the glamorous photos suggested. Friends at the time recalled nights where arguments echoed across the yard, and one makeup artist later whispered, "That woman worked through heartbreak the way some people work through laundry. Quiet, relentless, never-ending." Hollywood loved her brilliance but rarely understood her wounds. She won a BAFTA, earned 3 Oscar nominations, and became part of a family legacy that journalists compared to a dynasty built on resilience and rebirth. Yet the industry also watched her walk through the darkest tragedies a mother can endure, including the loss of her young daughter to a drowning accident. Police reports described it as an unpreventable incident. Diane once described it as, "the day the earth split beneath me." The tragedy followed her into every room she entered. Directors noticed it, co-stars felt it, even casting agents whispered, "She carries something heavy, but it makes her unforgettable." Then came her illness, the one that doctors claimed would take her life years before it actually did. Multiple medical reports from that period described her lungs as severely compromised, and a physician once admitted, "I didn't expect her to last 6 months." Yet somehow, miraculously, she did. Laura Dern later revealed that long walks with her mother, slow, breathless, trembling, became their shared ritual for survival. "We walked her back to life," she said. What the public didn't know was that Diane herself believed she had been given extra time for a reason. Her journals, later referenced by close friends, contained lines like, "I have something left to finish, I can feel it." Whether that something was emotional, spiritual, or simply a mother's desire to stay beside her daughter a little longer, no one ever fully knew. And now, after her passing, those questions linger in the air like perfume fading from an empty hallway. In the end, Diane Ladd became more than an actress. She became a testament to a strange truth in Hollywood. Some stars burn bright, some stars burn out, and a rare few burn through the darkness itself. Before Diane Ladd became the Southern matriarch of American cinema, she was simply Diane, a girl running barefoot through the heat of Meridian, Mississippi, where cicadas cried louder than church bells and every porch carried a rumor. Her childhood was not the kind wrapped in lace and lullabies. It was a world of working-class survival, where faith, superstition, and buried tension lived together in the same cramped rooms. Her father, a veterinarian, was a man who understood animals more easily than people. Her mother, a housewife with a tender voice, carried dreams she never had the luxury to chase. Neighbors used to say the Ladds were too proud to ask for help but too wounded to thrive. In later years, Diane would describe her parents in a sentence that felt like poetry carved from truth. They loved each other fiercely and fought just as fiercely. Court documents from local archives, rarely discussed publicly, describe multiple financial struggles, medical expenses, and family disputes that shadowed her early years. A childhood friend remembered that Diane spoke like a girl older than her bones, as if she had already learned that life does not hand out kindness for free. Yet that southern land, wild and imperfect, gave her something Hollywood could never teach: depth. The stories whispered at night, the church choirs trembling with sorrow, the funerals that felt more crowded than the weddings. All of it fed her imagination. She listened, she watched, she absorbed. Actors interviewed decades later all said the same thing. Diane didn't act. She remembered. There was also something else, a strange, intuitive sensitivity, a quality her relatives called the family antenna. Diane sensed emotions before people spoke them. She noticed the quiver in a neighbor's voice, the way a door slammed harder than it needed to, the silence that followed a lie. It was this instinct, almost psychic in its accuracy, that later made directors trust her with the most fragile characters. But childhood was not gentle with her. There were nights filled with shouting, long stretches of loneliness, and moments where money ran out before hope did. Letters she wrote as a teenager, preserved by cousins in Meridian, revealed a girl desperate to escape, yet terrified of what life outside might demand. "I want to go somewhere," she wrote, "but I don't know if the world wants me." The turning point came at a school play. Diane, only 16, stepped on stage with a candle in her hand, trembling, barefoot, dressed in homemade fabric. When the performance ended, a teacher told her mother, "She doesn't just perform, she channels something." That single sentence became the spark that set her future ablaze. Even then, tragedy hovered close. A cousin died in an accident. Her parents' health faltered. Family secrets festered quietly. These shadows shaped her. They carved out the empathy that made her characters breathe. They hardened the resilience that would later keep her alive through losses most people wouldn't survive. And when she finally left Mississippi, she carried her childhood like a suitcase packed with ghosts. The sound of gospel choirs, the ache of family fights, the softness of her mother's hands, the weight of things unsaid. Hollywood would one day celebrate her complexity, marvel at her emotional force, and applaud her raw realism, never knowing that all she did was pour the Mississippi of her childhood into every role she touched. Hollywood in the late 1950 seconds was a city with a cruel sense of humor. It welcomed newcomers with open arms, only to see whether they could survive the bite. When Diane Ladd arrived, she wasn't the classic beauty the casting offices were hunting for. She wasn't blonde enough, tall enough, or soft enough. What she had was something far rarer, an emotional force that unsettled people before it impressed them. At first, no one knew what to do with her. Agents said she was too intense. Producers called her too raw. Studio executives claimed she had the eyes of a woman who's seen too much. They weren't wrong. Diane carried the Mississippi soil in her speech, her stride, her stare. It wasn't performative. It was her. And Hollywood didn't know how to package authenticity that sharp. She started the way many forgotten legends do. Background roles, underpaid gigs, long, lonely nights in motel rooms that smelled of cigarettes and broken dreams. She once told a friend, "I didn't come here to be pretty. I came here to work." That attitude, stubborn and quietly rebellious, began catching attention. Actors from her early workshop classes remembered her arriving with notebooks full of scribbles, observations about strangers, lines overheard on buses, the cadence of grief at a funeral shed passed earlier that week. She studied humanity like a private detective, and it showed. Film critics who discovered her early work noted something unusual. Diane didn't play characters, she inhabited them. A director later revealed, "She walked onto set carrying her own weather." Another said, "I didn't cast an actress. I cast a history." But while her talent was ascending, her personal life was slipping into chaos. Her marriage to Bruce Dern began like a wildfire. Passionate, reckless, irresistible. Then it turned into the kind of domestic storm that neighbors pretended not to hear. Friends recalled late-night visits, Diane appearing at their door with swollen eyes, whispering, "We're just going through a difficult patch." Court papers from those years, the ones no one ever talks about, hinted at a marriage fueled by ambition and damaged by ego. Both were rising actors. Both were hungry. Both were terrified of failure. That combination rarely ends tenderly. There were arguments so intense that co-stars could feel the tension when Bruce visited the set. There were nights Laura Dern, still a child, remembered the walls vibrating. A makeup artist from one of Diane's early films confessed, "She'd sit in my chair, trembling slightly, but once the camera rolled, she turned into a giant." And then came the first real break. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, 1974. The role that turned her into a force. The Hollywood Reporter later called her performance too real to be comfortable. Some viewers swore they could feel Diane's own pain bleeding through the screen. One studio executive admitted, "She didn't act that role. She exercised something." Behind the scenes, the cast noticed strange moments. Diane going quiet for hours, staring at objects as if remembering something only she could see. A co-star once said, "I think she was reaching back to Mississippi, or maybe to something darker." Her nomination for Best Supporting Actress was more than a recognition. It was a warning to Hollywood. This woman would not be ignored. Yet the nomination also brought pressure. Agents pushed her to soften her image. Studios wanted her to play glamorous roles she despised. Journalists wrote about her marriage more than her work, and whispers about the tragic loss of her daughter followed her. Like a faint shadow, always there, always just behind her. Diane never spoke publicly about how that grief fueled her ambition. But colleagues noticed. A famous acting coach once said, "She worked as if she was running from something she couldn't outrun." Early career Diane Ladd was not a rising star. She was a survivor, learning how to shine through scars. And Hollywood, whether it was ready or not, had found a woman it could no longer shape, only witness. By the time the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds unfurled across Hollywood, Diane Ladd had transformed from the raw Southern newcomer into a figure critics described as a storm disguised as a woman. Her rise was not explosive but volcanic, slow, simmering, inevitable, and impossible to stop once the world finally felt the heat beneath her performances. Her peak was unusual. Most stars are lifted by glamour. Diane was lifted by gravity, the heavy, soul-deep gravity that pulled audiences into her orbit the moment she opened her mouth. Wild at Heart, 1990, changed everything. David Lynch, the cinematic surrealist who saw beauty inside chaos, chose her to play Marietta Fortune, a character so unhinged, so emotionally fractured, that even seasoned actors hesitated. Diane did not hesitate. She walked into the role like stepping into a familiar storm. Crew members said she would shift moods in a heartbeat, from laughter to a chilling stillness that made people step back without understanding why. Nicolas Cage later said, "Acting with Diane is like acting with lightning. You're never sure where it'll strike, but you know it will." The Academy nomination that followed wasn't merely a nod to her talent. It was an acknowledgement that Diane Ladd had become the kind of actress who forced Hollywood to confront its own limitations. She portrayed women who were messy, scared, jealous, furious, loving, vulnerable, often all at the same time. But the most haunting part of her peak was not the awards. It was the moment mother and daughter collided in the same spotlight. Rambling Rose, 1991, a film that rewrote Hollywood history. Diane Ladd and Laura Dern, mother and daughter, both nominated for Oscars for the same film. The industry had never seen such a thing. Media outlets called it a bloodline of brilliance. Journalists described it as talent coded in DNA. But behind the glamour, there was another story. A producer from the film later confessed, Diane and Laura carried something deep between them. A grief, a bond, a secret language. The set felt like a shrine to the child Diane had lost years earlier, the daughter who died before reaching adulthood. Laura once revealed, "My mother poured everything she could never give to my sister into her art." For Diane, this was not just a peak, it was a resurrection, a second chance to mother through creation. At events, photographers captured a glow between them that no lighting equipment could mimic. Yet even amid the applause, there were cracks. Nights where Diane excused herself early. Interviews where her voice trembled when family was mentioned. Moments where Laura gently squeezed her mother's hand backstage as if anchoring her to the present. Her peak also exposed the fragility of the industry surrounding her. Directors described her as fearless. Actors described her as unpredictable. Critics described her as dangerously honest, a rare fact whispered among insiders. Diane often rewrote lines on set not to challenge directors, but because she intuitively sensed emotional truths the script overlooked. One filmmaker admitted, "She understood human psychology better than some therapists." Her performances from this era weren't just acting, they were excavations. Hollywood journalists began using phrases like the Ladd effect, referring to her ability to turn even small roles into seismic emotional events. Casting directors said, "Give her 5 minutes. She'll steal the film." And she did repeatedly. But the peak carried a darker cost. With fame came resurfaced trauma. Old wounds from her marriage to Bruce Dern became media fodder. The tragedy of her daughter's death was brought up in interviews with a coldness only Hollywood could muster. And the industry's pressure to stay relevant tightened like a noose. Her journals from that era, shared years later by close friends, included lines like, "Success is heavier than failure, and every award reminds me of what I couldn't save." Still, Diane pushed forward. She appeared in films, television, stage productions, working with the energy of someone racing time itself. Friends suspected she feared slowing down would force her to face memories she spent decades outrunning. Through it all, she remained unmistakable. Sharp, spiritual, a little strange in the most beautiful way. One critic wrote, "Diane Ladd performs like a woman who has seen God and grief in the same room." A co-star said, "She never lied on screen. That's what scared people." Her peak wasn't defined by fame. It was defined by depth, the kind that comes only from surviving the unimaginable and turning pain into power. Diane Ladd didn't rise to Hollywood's top. She carved her name into it with her own broken hands. Fame never protected Diane Ladd. If anything, it exposed her wounds to brighter lights. Her downfall didn't arrive as a sudden collapse. It came quietly, like a fog that thickened year by year: grief, illness, betrayal, regret, and the terrifying awareness that time was no longer something she could negotiate with. The tragedy began long before her final years, in the moment that remained the fracture line of her entire life: the death of her young daughter. Police files from the era described it clinically: accidental drowning. But to Diane, it was something deeper, something she carried like a bruise on the soul. Family friends said she never spoke the child's name without pausing first, as if preparing her lungs for pain. One old friend whispered, "That grief followed her into every role, every interview, every breath." On film sets, there were days where she suddenly withdrew into silence, staring at the floor, fingers trembling, mind drifting to a place no one could follow. A director on a mid-80 seconds project recalled, "She would step away, hold onto a wall, and breathe like she was fighting ghosts." But the public didn't see those moments. They saw the awards, the charisma, the interviews where she smiled politely while swallowing memories sharp enough to cut her in half. Then came something darker, something physical: the illness. The one her doctors whispered about in hallways, flipping through tests with faces drained of certainty. In 2018, before the world knew anything, Diane collapsed during a walk with Laura Dern. Reports later revealed her lungs were severely compromised, her breathing shallow, her prognosis terrifying. A physician who treated her admitted, she was not expected to survive another 6 months, but Diane didn't die. She refused. Laura pushed her mother to walk slowly, painfully every single day. Passers-by in their Ojai neighborhood remembered seeing Diane leaning on her daughter, taking steps so fragile it felt like witnessing a sacred ritual. Journalists later described it as a pilgrimage between mother and child, yet the miracle of her recovery came with shadows. Diane believes she had been given borrowed time, something extra, something unnatural. Close friends who visited her during that period said she talked often about unfinished business, unresolved guilt, and a debt to life she hadn't repaid. One friend stated, "It was like she knew the clock was ticking, even after she got better." As the years passed, Diane worked more, not less, as if outrunning her own expiration date. Her family said she sometimes woke in the middle of the night, gasping, telling Laura she felt pulled by something. Whether it was fear, premonition, or simple exhaustion, no one knew. Hollywood, meanwhile, watched her fade. Her presence on red carpets became rare. Her voice in interviews slowed. Her movements changed softer, hesitant, as if she were maneuvering through invisible pain. During one late-night TV appearance, viewers noticed she paused mid-sentence, eyes clouding over with a grief that seemed to surface without warning. Afterward, a producer whispered to the host, "Shez battling more than she'll ever admit." And then came the final mystery, the one that clung to her last months. In 2024, before her death became public knowledge, neighbors reported seeing an ambulance at her Ojai home multiple times. Medical staff avoided answering questions. Laura Dern made vague emotional posts about cherishing moments, holding on, and miracles in the dark. A family friend revealed that Diane occasionally spoke of the daughter she lost as if she were still near. Not hallucinations, more like a presence, a memory alive, breathing, haunting. Her personal journals included a chilling line written in the final year of her life. "When your time stretches longer than it should, the past begins to walk beside you." Even Laura admitted in an interview. Sometimes she talked like she was already halfway to another world. The final decline was quiet but relentless. Her breathing worsened. Her mobility weakened. Her dreams, as she described them, became crowded with old faces. On her last morning, Laura held her hand. She said her mother looked beyond the room, as if focusing on someone just out of sight. Then Diane whispered something Laura has never repeated, a final sentence that left her daughter in tears as she slipped into stillness. Doctors listed her cause of death as complications from lung disease, but those who knew her believed it was something deeper. A woman whose heart had carried too much sorrow for too many years, finally letting go. Diane Ladd's tragedy wasn't a single moment. It was a lifetime stitched together with beauty, suffering, resilience, and secrets only she fully understood. In the final stretch of her life, Diane Ladd existed in a strange space between reality and memory, a space where the living and the lost seemed to sit beside her in the same quiet room. Her later years in Ojai, California were peaceful on the surface, a small house wrapped in sunlit trees, neighbors who waved from their porches, birdsong drifting through the windows at dawn. But inside that home, time behaved differently. Friends who visited her described the atmosphere as gentle but heavy, like a place where every object carried a story. Diane spent long afternoons sitting in her garden, touching the leaves, listening to the wind, sometimes closing her eyes as if hearing a voice only she recognized. A close friend recalled. She talked about nature like it was an old teacher. She said trees knew more about grief than people did. Her relationship with Laura Dern deepened into something sacred. Not mother and daughter, not actresses, but two souls trying to savor every borrowed day. They walked together slowly, carefully on the same paths that once helped Diane rebuild her lungs. Passers-by often saw Laura's hand on her mother's back, guiding her step by step. Some said it looked like Laura was carrying her mother through time itself. Interview clips from this period showed Diane smiling often, but the smiles were different, softer, slower, edged with the knowledge that each moment was a small victory against the inevitable. When asked about her health, she never lied, but never surrendered. "I'm still here. That's enough." Yet behind the grace, her body was fading. Her breathing tightened. Her weight dropped. Her energy drained so quickly that some days she could only speak in whispers. But the most mysterious shift came in her mind and spirit. People close to her said she began speaking often about her late daughter, not in the past tense, but as if she were nearby. During one conversation, Diane paused mid-sentence, looked toward the empty hallway, and murmured, "Shez all right now." A nurse who cared for her in the last months confessed that Diane would sometimes reach into the air beside her bed, as if holding a small hand. It unsettled the staff at first, until they realized these moments calmed her more than medication ever could. As her illness advanced, Diane began revisiting old memories with startling clarity. She spoke of Mississippi, the church choirs, the childhood storms, the first time she set foot on a stage. At other times, she told Laura stories she had never dared to share before, secrets about her marriage, confessions about her regrets, reflections on the roles she took and the ones she turned down. One night, Laura recorded a conversation never released publicly, where her mother said, "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of leaving something unfinished." When Laura asked what that something was, Diane only smiled and replied, "You." Her final days unfolded in a dimly lit room filled with photographs, some framed, some simply taped to the wall. Co-stars later said it felt fitting for a woman whose life was a mosaic of triumph and heartbreak. There were no dramatic medical emergencies, no chaotic final hours, just a slow descent, a quiet dimming. In the last 48 hours, her breathing grew shallow, her skin cool, Laura stayed beside her, reading to her, touching her face, sometimes crying softly. A longtime friend said there was a peace in her eyes, but also something else, recognition. Like she was seeing someone she had been waiting for. And then came the morning. Before the sun climbed over Ojai's hills, Diane opened her eyes one last time. Laura held her hand. Witnesses said Diane looked toward the corner of the room, smiled faintly, and whispered a sentence no one else could hear. Seconds later, she was gone. The house felt impossibly silent, the kind of silence that only follows the passing of someone who loved fiercely and suffered deeply. Diane Ladd's final days were not tragic in their chaos. They were tragic in their tenderness, the quiet surrender of a woman who had fought for decades, loved beyond measure, and carried memories that never stopped reaching for her. When Diane Ladd left this world, Hollywood didn't just lose an actress. It lost one of its last living bridges to an era where performances were carved from life, not manufactured for applause. Her absence didn't feel like a disappearance. It felt like a light turning off in a hallway people didn't realize had been lit for decades. Her legacy ripple effects across multiple generations, each seeing her through a different lens. To filmmakers, she was a blueprint. Directors often spoke of her ability to bend reality on camera, not by exaggerating emotion, but by exposing it. David Lynch once told a journalist, "Diane brought the storm with her. All I had to do was turn on the camera." Her performances in Wild at Heart, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and Rambling Rose are studied in film schools today as examples of emotional truth that can't be taught, only lived. To actors, she was a quiet revolutionary. Young performers sought her out backstage, asking how she accessed such depth. She always answered the same way, "Tell the truth, even when it hurts you." Co-stars said working with her felt like standing in front of a mirror that saw the parts of you you'd spent years hiding. She forced honesty out of everyone around her, a gift and a challenge. To critics, she was impossible to categorize. She didn't fit the mold of a leading lady, nor the cliches of a character actress. She lived in a third space, one that critics dubbed emotional realism. Even late in her career, reviewers wrote things like, "Ladd doesn't deliver lines, she excavates them." To audiences, she was something gentler, a familiar presence, a reminder that flawed people could still be beautiful, that brokenness didn't have to be hidden. And to Laura Dern, she was everything. Mother, mentor, mirror, shadow, teacher. Their joint Oscar nominations remain one of the most iconic mother-daughter moments in Hollywood history, not because of the awards, but because of the story behind them. A family stitched together through grief, art, and survival. But Diane's cultural impact stretches beyond film reels. There is a mythic quality to her life story, a woman shaped by the South, haunted by tragedy, resurrected by art, nearly claimed by illness, then returned for one last chapter she wasn't supposed to have. Professors of American cinema have compared her to Tennessee Williams' heroines. Fragile, fierce, poetic, and painfully aware of life's silent wounds. Rare recordings from panel discussions show Diane speaking about grief with an eerie clarity. "Sometimes sorrow becomes a second home. You learn to live in it." This single quote became a cornerstone of discussions about emotional realism in acting. One lesser-known fact: Diane spent years mentoring young women in the industry, privately coaching actresses who later became major stars. She never asked for credit. She believed giving was part of healing. Even the circumstances of her recovery, nearly dying from lung disease, then walking back to life with her daughter, have taken on legendary status. Writers describe it as a real-life fable of survival, a symbol of resilience woven into Hollywood's modern mythology. After her passing, tributes poured in from across the world. Co-stars shared stories of her wisdom. Fans posted messages calling her the heart of Southern cinema. Laura Dern's voice cracked as she spoke of her mother's final courage. Yet the most powerful tribute comes from the fact that Diane Ladd's work doesn't fade. Rewatch her films today, and her characters still breathe, still ache, still burn. That is her legacy. A woman who turned her suffering into art, timeless enough to outlive her. A performer who taught Hollywood that truth, raw, unsettling, and unpolished, is more enduring than fame. And in the quiet corners of cinema history, her name glows like an ember that refuses to go out. Looking back at Diane Ladd's life, it becomes clear that Hollywood never fully understood the magnitude of the woman it had in its hands. This was not simply an actress with talent. This was someone sculpted by sorrow, shaped by survival, and sharpened by a lifetime of emotional truth. And yet, for all the praise she earned, her story carries a weight that many fans today still don't fully grasp. From this channel's perspective, Diane Ladd represents a rare kind of celebrity, not the glittering icon, not the scandal-driven headline, but the soul actor, the kind whose performances were cut from the fabric of real, lived human pain. Watching her films now, especially those from the late 70 seconds through the 90 seconds, you sense something different. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't acting sad or broken or furious. She was channeling something old inside herself, something she never got rid of, even when the world expected her to. Hollywood loved the brilliance, but never asked about the bruises behind it. That, perhaps, is the great tragedy. Her marriage shook her. Her daughter's death nearly destroyed her. Her illness almost took her years before her time. And still, she remained present emotionally, spiritually, artistically, in a way that very few managed to. Her comeback after doctors predicted she had months left is something we rarely talk about in the context of film history, but it should be, because it wasn't just a medical miracle. It was the final act of a woman who refused to leave without finishing her story. From a cultural standpoint, her influence on Laura Dern is undeniable. Watching Laura grow into one of Hollywood's most respected actresses is like seeing Diane's fire living on in another body. Their bond, born from grief, stitched together with art, might be one of the most powerful mother-daughter legacies Hollywood has ever seen. Yet there is an eerie, haunting quality to Diane's final chapter. The way she seemed to sense her time was borrowed. The way she spoke to the past as if it were alive. The way she softened in her last years, as if preparing for an ending only she could see. This channel's stance is simple. Diane Ladd's greatness came not from perfection, but from scars. Not from the glamour Hollywood offered, but from the grief life forced upon her. Her achievements are undeniable: 3 Oscar nominations, a BAFTA win, unforgettable performances. But her flaws, her losses, her mysteries, those are what make her human. Those are what make her unforgettable. In a world obsessed with fame, Diane Ladd was something far more valuable. A reminder that art becomes immortal only when it is honest. And perhaps the most haunting question she leaves behind is this: if she had not suffered what she did, would her performances have ever been the same? Some stories leave us debating, hers leaves us remembering. There is something strangely comforting about the way Diane Ladd's story settles in the heart. Not because it is gentle, it isn't. Not because it is hopeful, though at moments it is. But because her life reminds us of a truth we often avoid. The people who seem the strongest are usually carrying the most fragile memories. When you revisit her films now, you can almost feel her presence moving through the frames, not as an actress, but as a woman who lived every emotion twice, once in life, once on screen. That's why her characters still feel warm, bruised, breathing, even decades later. She left pieces of herself in each of them. There is a scene in Rambling Rose where she looks at Laura Dern with eyes full of worry, love, and unspoken regret. Watch it again knowing her real story, and it becomes something else entirely. A mother haunted by the child she lost. A woman trying to rewrite her own past through a role. A soul holding 2 daughters at once, one living, one gone. Maybe that is why people never forgot her. She didn't hide her wounds. She transformed them. In her final years, the image of Diane walking slowly beside Laura, breathing through pain, whispering gratitude for another day, it stays with you. Like a photograph you don't remember taking, but can't throw away. The kind that feels like a reminder of everything you, too, have survived. And yet, there is still mystery. Mystery in the way she spoke to the past. Mystery in the smile she gave someone unseen in her final moments. Mystery in the sentence she whispered, the one Laura will never share. Perhaps some truths belong only to the person who carries them. Diane Ladd's life was never meant to be neat. It was meant to be real, messy, brave, beautiful in its suffering. The kind of life that doesn't end when breath stops, it lingers, like perfume on an old scarf, like a voice inside a dream, like a lesson whispered long after the teacher is gone. And maybe that is the point. Some stars burn out quietly, some shatter into darkness. But a rare few, the rarest, leave a slow glow behind them, a glow that stays in the corners of memory long after the world believes it has faded. Diane Ladd was one of those rare few. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,